So, welcome back to the third part of Lecture 2. We have been discussing various topics today. Think of ethical relativism, some problems with ethical relativism. So now we're going to continue with ethical absolute theories. And ethical absolutism, as I already explained in the end of part 2 of today's lecture, is a perspective that assumes that ethical principles are eternal and universally applicable. Right? So irrespective of the context, irrespective of the time, the place where you live, your background, etc., we all should adhere to the same moral principle. Within this category of ethical absolutist theories, we can differentiate between two types of theories. So when we are going to act in a certain way, we can of course evaluate this action using some kind of ethical principle. An act that might have some kind of moral dimension to it, of course, has also an outcome, right? Something might happen as a consequence of my act. But an act is also motivated by certain principles. So for example, you're now listening to this lecture, and there might be different motivations to listen to this lecture. You want to learn something, you might not have anything to do, and you're cleaning your house, and it would be nice to listen to this lecture, or anything else. You might have difficulties falling asleep, and therefore you're listening to this lecture. So there may be various motivations for the same act, and the consequences might also be very different. If you're listening to this lecture because you want to learn something, you're more likely to pass this course than when you're listening to this lecture because you have difficulties falling asleep. Or at least that's what I'm assuming. So we can differentiate between motivation and outcome, and also within this category of absolute moral theories, there are two types that also, on the one hand, look at the outcomes of an act, and we call those consequentialist theories. And we can also look at the motivation of an action, and we call those non-consequentialist theory. I think that's an easy thing to remember, right? Consequentialist also already refers to the consequences of an act, whereas non-consequentialist does not look at the consequences. So if we look at, for example, a non-consequentialist theory, then whatever the consequences are going to be, this doesn't really matter at all. So we're only looking at sort of the internal motivation of why you decide to do something. And on the other hand, if we have a theory that only looks at the outcome of a theory, then all the things that went before that, so why you did something, a good intention that you might have had, does not matter for the evaluation of this outcome. So in the first part of this lecture, we discussed the trolley problem. And remember, when we were discussing this problem, we had an ethical dilemma that we were faced with. We could either save 5 lives at the expense of 1 by pulling the lever, or we could sacrifice 1, or we could not pull the lever and then let 5 people die. So there were different motivations, internal, let's say internal moral motivations, that respond to two theories that we're going to discuss now. The utilitarian point of view that would evaluate the consequences of an act and has the principle to promote overall good, and the non-consequentialist theory of ethics of duty that looks at the respect for human dignity and individual rights. We're going to start with a discussion of utilitarianism, and then in part 4 we will touch upon ethics of duty. So, as I already told you a couple of minutes ago, we differentiate between non-consequentialist and consequentialist theories, and utilitarianism is an example of the latter. So it's a consequentialist theory, and therefore the morality of an action depends on the rightness of the consequences of our actions. According to utilitarians, we should ask ourselves what the consequences of our actions are. So we should pick the best action, or the action that will yield the best possible outcome. Of course, this also raises the question what actually a best possible outcome is. How do we know this? So we need some kind of principle that can help us to decide whether the outcomes of one act versus the outcomes of another act have the best possible outcome. And there is one principle that can actually help us to answer this question, and I'm going to tell you a bit about this principle. So, utilitarianism is the moral theory that states that we should act in ways that produce the most pleasure or happiness and the least amount of suffering for the greatest number of people affected by our actions. So we should actually act in such a way that we promote happiness and minimize harms. And that is actually the principle of utility that is the key principle in utilitarianism. So actions are right if they promote pleasure or happiness, but they are wrong if they do not do so. So if there is a range of actions that you can choose from, the idea is that you're going to evaluate for each of these actions how much pleasure they promote and how much wrongs they also do. And then if you evaluate that for each of the actions that are within your action range, you choose the action that has the most or the largest promotion of pleasure and happiness. So this is called the principle of utility, as back in the days, these philosophers that were sort of the founding figures of utilitarianism, they equated welfare with pleasure or happiness. So for them, the idea was how can we actually promote welfare? How can we make our society best off? And for them, welfare was actually the same as pleasure and happiness, right? You feel, or yeah, you're best off if you're the happiest. Modern utilitarianism often or sometimes use different metrics, so they do not necessarily equate welfare to pleasure, and they also might use some economic metrics, but this is not something that we're going to discuss into detail in today's lecture. So if we look at the founding fathers, or founding figures, I should say, because there's also a woman among these key figures, then there are three key figures that we should discuss here. These were all, let's say, 18th and 19th century philosophers, and Jeremy Bentham, the figure on your left, was actually the founding father. He was a philosopher and a lawyer, and he was one of the first people to split ethical thinking from religious beliefs, which was at that time, this was during sort of the Enlightenment, a very new and rigorous idea, right? That there would be something else, or that morality would not be linked to religious beliefs. So there were no commandment of gods that tell you what to do. And you would not also be punished by God if you do the wrong things. But it's the pursuit of happiness that is most important, and that should guide our morality. So how did Jeremy Bentham actually come up with this idea? Because it was, well, really novel, and also at that time like a really novel idea. And he came actually to that idea that we should strive to promote happiness by looking around him, and he was actually wondering what drives us as human beings. How do people live good lives? And when he was looking around and observing, he actually found out that we are driven by two masters, seeking pleasure, right? Wanting to experience pleasure, and minimize harms or suffering. And according to Bentham, this would actually be the principle, seeking pleasure, minimizing harms, that should be used to organize society, because eventually this would promote good. So also relevant for us now, how should business be organized, right? Should it be organized following this principle of minimizing harms and maximizing pleasure? Then if we move to the right, we meet John Stuart Mill, a 19th century philosopher, and he was actually a political economist as well as a philosopher that lived in Britain at the time. And he further sort of developed Bentham's principles and developed it into an ethical system that we're also now using and discussing today. He was married to Harriet Taylor, the woman on the right, and she was actually greatly influential on Mill. They were married, right? So they lived together, but in his thinking, many of the sort of key ideas that are now essential to utilitarianism are probably developed by Harriet Taylor. At that time, you might know this, it was very difficult for women to, be a thinker in their own right, right? So it was not very common for a woman to be a philosopher and to also publish her ideas. So therefore, John Stuart Mill was influenced by her, maybe also gave space to Harriet to influence his thinking. And he was also, in his part, very recognizable to her efforts, and he was always very open about this. One of the ideas that Harriet Taylor actually developed on her own account and in her own name was also the plight of women that should be included if we are truly interested in maximizing happiness in society. Then it also means that the situation of women should be improved. A bit of a different picture, but this is actually Jeremy Bentham, the founding father of utilitarianism, and this shows you how much Bentham actually sort of used or lived by these principles of utilitarianism. He was very serious about it. He founded University College London when he was still alive, and when he was still alive, he actually wondered, well, how can my body yield the greatest amount of happiness after my death? Right? So a body can be buried, it can be devoted and used by science, but he actually came to the conclusion that his body would be most valuable if it would be put on display and inspire future generations of students. I think it's a bit of a funny example, right? You might wonder whether students are really inspired by this bombed body of him, but it was put on display, and you can still visit him in today's college. So let's go into the theory itself, utilitarianism. We have already been discussing very briefly that utilitarianists believed that maximizing welfare implies that you should maximize pleasure and minimize harms. And the principle, the key principle to utilitarianist thought, to evaluate whether an action is actually the right thing to do, is the greatest happiness principle. And this greatest happiness principle enables us to calculate the morally right thing to do. And of course, this greatest happiness principle, it already says it, is the idea that we should achieve the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people. So an action is correct when it maximizes happiness for the greatest number of people. So to calculate this principle, because in a way it's a cost-benefit analysis, we need three ingredients. We need to know the consequences of an act, right? So what are going to be the consequences? And these can be direct consequences, but also think of future consequences. And for each of these consequences, we need to figure out how much happiness they involve or bring about and how much pain. And in the end, we also need to make sure that we treat all the different stakeholders that are affected by our action, that we treat them equally. So for utilitarians, it was very important that, and that also links to this ideal of Harriet Taylor, to treat women equally as men, that also in these calculations, every person affected would be treated equally. Right? So it's not the case that my happiness is more important than yours or the other way around, but in that sense, it was a very neutral and objective calculation, trying to analyze how much everybody would be affected in terms of happiness and harms, and then taking all the different stakeholders that are affected by a certain act into account. So let's look a bit more closely at each of these three ingredients. So we start with the consequences. It's the first ingredient for this greatest happiness principle. And on the slide you can find a quote of Bentham, Jeremy Bentham, the founder of Utilitarianism. And if I may read it out loud, it says, "All action is for the sake of some end, and rules of action must take their whole character and color from the end to which they are subservient." It's a bit of an old English quote, but what it comes down to is that all our actions lead to a certain outcome, right? If you choose to do something, there will be consequences. And these actions, they will be good if they lead to good outcomes, and they will be bad if they lead to bad outcomes. And it should be noted that, of course, there may be consequences that are very direct and can be observed directly, but there may also be consequences that are indirect and might only be observable later on in time. So it's something to be carefully evaluated and to also consider, well, if I'm going to do something, if a certain act prevails, what could be the consequences? Is there a consequence on fellow citizens? Is there a consequence on future generations? Is there a consequence on the environment, etc., right? So there may be very different stakeholders that are affected by a certain action. And you might also think here a bit back to our first tutorial. If you've attended the tutorial, you will remember, hopefully, that we have been discussing 3 cases there. And the first case was about hiring decisions, right? You were a supermarket manager and you were given the task to hire someone to stack the shelves and to clean the shop floor, etc. Well, the question there was, well, who to hire? You had some information about who they were. Some had children, some did not. Some were older, some were younger, etc. Of course, from a utilitarian perspective, you could wonder for each of these candidates what would be the consequence of their hiring in terms of happiness and pains. If you would do that for each of the candidates and compare these analyses, the cost-benefit analyses, you could decide which of these yields the greatest happiness and thus would be the best outcome from a utilitarian perspective. So let's go to the next ingredient, happiness. So we've already been discussing a bit that from a utilitarian perspective, you should select those actions that promote happiness and minimize harms, right? So only these consequences matter. So Bentham again, he wrote something about happiness, and he wrote that the ultimate end is an existence exempt as far as possible from pain, harms, and as rich as possible in enjoyments, happiness, both in point of quality and quantity and quality. Right? So happiness reduced to pleasure. We enjoy certain things more than others, and suffering reduces to pain. And in the end, you should choose those actions that have the greatest balance of happiness over pain. So again, if we think back to the first tutorial and to this case where we had to hire the best candidate, we can of course also wonder which choice would bring about the most happiness and minimize harms. And then we can move to the third ingredient, and that was equality. So everyone and everybody's preferences receive in the utilitarian calculus an equal weight. So, and you might, if you think a bit back to these times, it was the 18th century, class differences were still huge. Some people were much more important than others. This was a revolutionary idea, right? That men would be equal to women, that the nobility would be equally as important as the poor. In our world, I think, well, of course, there are still many differences between people, unfortunately, but I think the idea that everybody should be treated equally is at least much more common. And in the utilitarian calculus, all the preferences of everybody receive an equal weight. So it's an impartial analysis. It's like a bird's eye view in which we view everybody equally. And Bentham wrote about this as between his or her own happiness and that of others, utilitarianism requires him or her to be as strictly impartial as a disinterested and benevolent spectator. Right? So he writes, irrespective of your own happiness and that of others, if you're going to use this greatest happiness principle, you should be strictly impartial. So do not choose sides, not for yourself, not for others, and try to be someone that is watching from above, not knowing the background of everybody that you're observing, and based on that, evaluate the happiness and harms of everyone. Let me give you an example, right? Because you might be wondering, it's all very interesting. I hope at least that you're thinking that. But it's an ancient philosopher, 300 years old. Why are we learning a theory like this in a modern course on business ethics? Well, I think it also makes sense from a business point of view to at least be aware of this idea that utilitarianism promotes. So imagine that you are working in a company and there is a question whether to launch a new product. Let's say it's a new phone that has a very long-lasting battery. Right? Could be very interesting because always your battery is running low. So a phone with a long-lasting battery would be super useful. Well, if that would be the question for you as an employee at a company, you might start off with weighing pros and cons, right? So you're going to brainstorm about this with your colleagues. What could be the pros? Well, if we're going to launch a new product, then there will be new jobs created. Right? We need more people because this will, well, the phone needs to be produced. There will have to be new processes, production processes set up. So there will be new hires. Well, that's potentially useful and, of course, beneficial for happiness, right? New jobs, people receive a wage, and that will probably add to their happiness. It will solve an important problem, right? Long-lasting batteries, having a battery that runs low all the time, something that people are frustrated about. So if we can give them a new phone, then probably many people are happy, right? So it will also make our customers happy. Now, on the other hand, it could be that the production of this new battery has some kind of toxic ingredient in there that is very bad for the environment, for the people surrounding the mine where it has to be mined, the people that are working there in the mine under very bad circumstances. Well, you can think of some cons that have to do with mining this ingredient. Environmental problems in the long run, right, etc. Now, the question is, how are we going to balance these pros and cons, right? That's quite difficult to put a number on this, and I'll get back to that in a bit. And also another important thing to realize, because we can of course make a cost-benefit analysis and apply this greatest benefit or happiness principle to it and then decide, but we should of course also realize that there may be other courses of action available to us. Could be that there are also other products that can be launched. Well, for each of these products, we should analyze the pros and cons, weigh them, and then if we have done all of these analyses, we should pick the option that maximizes happiness. Let's once more get back to our greatest happiness principle, right? So in sum, if we put everything together, from a utilitarian point of view, an action is morally right if it results in the greatest amount of good, pleasure, for the greatest number of people affected by that action, right? And we should choose that action that promotes the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. So it gives us a straightforward way of making ethical decisions. We should avoid harm, we should promote good, and we should weigh good and bad effects. I think that's a very simple way of going about to evaluate an ethical action or a decision. One thing that's very attractive of this utilitarian point of view is that it appears to be very fair, right? We discussed everybody counts, everybody's preferences are taken into account, and therefore it's a very impartial and objective way of balancing, weighing pros and cons. So I'm interested, and I know, again, I cannot really ask you, but maybe take some time to ask yourself whether you are convinced by this utilitarian point of view. What do you think of it? Is this something that you would use to make your decisions by, or do you think, well, it sounds really nice, sounds very attractive, but there are some caveats that we didn't discuss yet? So there are, of course, some problems. Let me discuss two. So this is an example of Philip Morris in the 1990s, and this deals with measurement problems, right? Already you might have had some kind of intuition about this, that if we want to weigh all the consequences of a certain decision, think of this example I just gave about launching a new product. How are we going to put a number on the harms to the environment versus the pleasure that consumers will get from buying our phone? That will be quite difficult. Well, some companies actually tried this, right? So they thought about how are we going to compare persons, how are we going to differentiate between different consequences of an act? And one example is Philip Morris, who made a cost-benefit analysis of cigarette consumption. And this was something that they did in the Czech Republic, and they were actually sued for this because, and I'm sure that you agree, this is very absurd. It's an absurd way of reasoning and thinking about something which is actually very bad. So they, of course, realize that if people smoke cigarettes, there is a likelihood that they will die before a certain age, right? So people will not become as old as they would have become if they would not have smoked those cigarettes. So, for example, they realized that if people were to die young, due to smoking cigarettes, this will save housing, save money on housing for elderly. On top of that, also if people were to die early, that would save expenses on pension, social expenses, as well as health costs, right? So these are all costs that are saved if people were to die early. On the other hand, there are also things you won't save. You might have to compensate people if they die due to cigarettes. There might also, if people were to die early, they can no longer pay taxes, right? So that's a loss of income. And they really brainstormed about all the potential consequences of smoking, and they put that in a nice table with a certain outcome that either was beneficial or a loss. Well, I think it's a very unintuitive conclusion, right? So if smoking would be good for society, which is what they actually concluded in their analysis, then of course everybody should start to smoke, right? If it's good, from a utilitarian perspective at least, then everybody should just start to smoke. And this seems odd and absurd, right? It's even an argument that will be contradictory in itself, because if everybody starts to smoke, of course also more people would face an early death, and eventually the harms or the losses would be much larger than the benefits. On top of that, I guess that most of you, maybe even all of you, would also agree with me that you cannot really put a dollar's value on a person's life, right? So it will be very difficult, if not ethically unjust, to think about or put a value on someone's life. And I have another example, so on this picture you see the protests that were taking place in the aftermath following upon the death of George Floyd in the United States. And these Black Lives Matter protests, they were really heated, right? Everywhere in the United States there were huge protests of people, towns that were lit on fire, etc. Now imagine that in one of these states there was a governor, or you would be the governor, that was thinking about these riots and protests and wants to make sure or ensure that these protests would stop and that they would maybe turn into protests that were a bit less heated. Well, and you come up with a solution, namely to imprison a couple of white policemen, because you think that this would give the crowd a sense of, well, whatever, that they would have the feeling that they would be heard. In this scenario, it could be that one person is put to jail to calm the mob, even if this person did not do anything wrong. And there can be many different examples that you can think of, also on a very small basis. For example, you're going to work in a team. It could be that you decide that only one person is going to work on the assignments and that the other three can actually just relax and enjoy eventually the grade that this one person has come up with. If we put this in a utilitarian calculus, then there is one person that is putting in a lot of effort to make an assignment. Probably this person won't enjoy this that much, so we can qualify that as a harm. Whereas the three other people are actually having a lot of free time that they can enjoy and spend on something else. So these would be qualified as happiness. Probably we would have an action that actually maximizes happiness here, right? But there is only one person in a way that is sacrificed such that the three others can enjoy themselves. And we call this also the scapegoat mechanism, and it's a much voiced critique to utilitarianism, because it allows you to, well, sacrifice one or a small group of people such that the majority can actually benefit. So with this, I would like to also conclude this third part of today's lecture. Take a break, and then we'll see each other back in a bit and discuss the last absolute theory of today, ethics of duty.